Let's spend our time in the excellent company of Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, who is in the studio. Welcome, Pete.
Good morning.
Your column yesterday, I think it sort of cut right to the bone, really. We love to get involved in other people's problems, don't we? We love to sort of traverse the world, telling them how to run their countries. You know, here we are sort of helping Ukraine and telling Russia what it ought to be doing and what it ought not to be doing, as if we have some kind of moral high ground.
Or as if we're top nation.
In how to run countries. Look at our country. We haven't got a clue how to run the
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Who would come here and say, oh, look, this is the place to seek advice on how to do it? And London is seethes with knife crime. The streets stink of marijuana. You can't find a doctor, even when you're dying. As far as I can see, it's becoming increasingly difficult. The transport system doesn't work because its roads are full of potholes. You'd think that the place had been invaded by the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, and taken it over. It is just so inefficient, incompetent, and unworkable. We're in no position to go around telling people. And then again, not merely are we in no position as a country which can't run itself, which seems to have entered some kind of mysterious fourth world where everything doesn't work and the weather is bad. But also, we don't really have any armed forces. And we've got this ridiculous Cold War superpower nuclear weapon which we can't possibly use, and an enormous aircraft carrier which keeps clunking out, and for which we don't even have any airplanes. And the tiniest army that we've had since, I think, the end of the 18th century. So what is this? And yet, all politicians long to make their reputations on the world stage, as if it was. I don't know. Do Dutch and Belgian and Spanish politicians constantly go on about other countries, or is it just us? I don't know. Americans, you can understand because they are a top nation, and they are fantastically rich. The country works after a fashion, and they have got lots and lots and lots of guns and bombs and airplanes and warships. So it's kind of it makes sense for them to be concerned with international affairs. But us.
Well,
It's really, really strange the way it plays such a huge part in our public discourse.
Well, do you think that Rishi and the gang basically use foreign problems as a smokescreen to cover up for our own problems?
Well, I think it is. But I mean, the people say they do this because they set out to solve domestic problems and then they fail. And so they then start going to G7 conferences and all the rest of it and beginning to feel important. But I can't actually accept this. They don't fail because these things are impossible to solve. Time and time again, in my work as a columnist, what do? I come up with opinions about things which I believe are wrong with the country. And I found myself saying the same thing over and over again about how I repeatedly went and wrote books about the subjects that I was worried about, with crime and punishment, the police, the education system, whatever it happens to be. And what seemed to me to be the case again and again is that the problems are completely soluble if only you're prepared to admit that the policies of the past 50 or 60 years have been a mistake and need to be undone. And that we used to do things better than we do them. We could now actually return in many cases to doing. Obviously, things have changed in some technical ways, but in general, we made political, ideological, and dogmatic mistakes, and we can put them back. The real problem with the country is that it's run by people who are still in the grip of a dogma which has failed on its own terms and won't admit it. And that's one of the reasons why they get so obsessed with abroad. The other thing is that they're all sort of, and I speak with knowledge of this, they're all sort of Trotskyists in a way. They're idealists. They want to change the world for the better, and they don't mind using violence to do it. In fact, my late brother was a great enthusiast for using violence to make the world better, and people said, well, he's become a neoconservative. I said, no, absolutely not. He's still the Trotskyist he always was. He's just found a different way of looking at this from the old Leninist one, where and decided that the United States is now the seat and heart of revolution in the world. He's not far wrong, was not far wrong, isn't far wrong now.
Now, I had the sociologist Frank Furedi on earlier, and I asked him basically what we're discussing. The question was, why is Britain quite so broken at the moment? And I wonder what you think of his answer. He said that, yes, we are beset by various problems that are not necessarily of our own making. There are problems in all sorts of countries, particularly around Europe right now, but that our escalating troubles may be down to the fact that this current set of politicians we have are uniquely incompetent. Would you have any truck with that?
Well, I don't know. I think there have been incompetent politicians in the past, and one thinks of figures such as Selwyn Lloyd and Ernest Marples and the rest, who've made terrible mistakes. And indeed, do you remember George Brown?
Yes, I do.
Of treasured memory.
Drunken George.
Tumble into the gutter from time to time. I don't think it's unique incompetence. I don't think they have any idea of what it is that they want to do. I think they all came into politics as a career with the main objective of certainly their first 10 years of actually becoming ministers. And then they're sat at a desk with these supposed levers of power in front of them, and they pull them, and nothing happens. And they don't really understand what it was that they came into power for. So it's not so much incompetence as the fact that people come into politics for different reasons. And a lot of people used to be in politics for genuine reasons of maybe they'd been through, in the case of people like Harold Macmillan or Dennis Healey, they'd been through war and they'd seen it and they didn't want to have that again. And that drove them quite strongly in the policies they pursued. Maybe they'd seen really serious poverty and they decided they were going to put an end to that. But these are not people like that. They haven't got these driving forces in them. Can you think of one of them who you'd go and listen to on any subject? If you had a choice of evening, go to the cinema and see an indifferent film, or go and listen to one of these men and women speaking about what really, really moved them, which would you do? There's no difficulty, because there isn't. Whereas when I used to cover politics, there were people whose speeches could fill the House of Commons. People would just turn up from everywhere. All the cafeterias and bars were empty. People would go and hear them because they were interesting to hear. And the press too. We'd all pile out of the press gallery bar and go into the actual chamber to listen to them because they had something to say. But which of this lot have anything to say? And since people like Tony Benn and Dennis Healey and one of my favourites, Tam DL, and you notice all the people I mentioned here on the left, as a matter of fact, but other people, Ian MacLeod, or indeed Kenneth Clarke, who have some sort of bottom to them on the other side, since they've disappeared, what are they? And I think the big difference is the transformation of politics from a thing that people went into after living to being a career which they went into straight out of university has quite a lot to do with it. But incompetence isn't it, really. What do you have to be competent at to be good at politics? Surely you have to know what it is that concerns you. You have to be willing to listen to serious ideas about how to fix it. And you need to be in some way a leader of men and women to persuade others to follow you in your decisions and to believe that you know what you're doing. And that's absent.
Yes, exactly. So it sort of leads into what I was going to ask you. I mean, basically, we've got these particular crises right now. Obviously, these shocking revelations today that 500 people are dying unnecessarily in A&E and NHS hospitals every week. We've got the strikes, rail strikes threatened, another week of chaos. We've got the ambulance driver strikes. We've got the nurses strikes, all really, really worrying. We've also got this migrant crisis, the escalating 45,700 across the channel, and all sorts of other problems. And it seems to me, you look at Rishi, you look at the cabinet, they're just sitting there looking at this stuff, not actually doing anything. Could they not even conspire to come up with some kind of illusion of activity?
I think in the case of Rishi Sunak, because he was Chancellor during one of the biggest mistakes ever made in modern politics, it's very hard for him to confront the consequences of his own error. And he was, there were plenty of others responsible, he was personally deeply responsible for the decision to go disproportionately to respond to the COVID problem with enormous amounts of spending and also by pretty much shutting down for a large period, in effect, the health service. And what do you think happens in a huge country, as this is a large country, with a highly advanced infrastructure system, if for a long, long period of time you put the brakes on and people still get ill, and they get iller and iller, and as they get iller they get harder to treat. And so when the hospitals eventually opened up again to full capacity, they can't cope because they weren't built for that. We haven't got the staff for it, or the skills, or the money to cover it. You have created a problem out of nothing which didn't exist before. And again, it goes back. So many of the problems we now face go back to the complete failure of our political class to think about what they were doing when the COVID problem emerged, or to come up with a proportionate response for it. And we'll suffer for that for a very long time. And in the case of Mr. Sunak, of course, this is personal. How can he now admit it? The difficulty here, it seems to me to be, once you've broken the rules about spending, which he broke on that scale, it's very hard for you to sit down now and say, well, actually, now we can't spend any money.
Well, in terms of, this is one thing that's been frustrating me. So we'll get no sort of element even of contrition on the part of people like Rishi Sunak, who clearly extended the furlough scheme far too long. We get no apology from the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, who has now taken to issuing regular statements saying, oh, well, the lockdowns have caused all sorts of problems socially and medically, and the NHS is in trouble because of the effect of the lockdowns. At no point in these statements does he mention that he's the architect of the lockdowns. He was the one who pushed for them. And at no point does he apologise for the results.
No, and those who won't admit their mistakes are doomed to repeat them. But this is also a problem in my own trade. There were an awful lot of people in the media who joined in with this, and who still have not in any way. I don't want some parades of people in dances caps through the streets admitting they were wrong. I just want people themselves to say that they were wrong. Rather than to continue to suggest that people like me were putting out disinformation. The revelations that are coming out about what happened at Twitter in the United States during this, the suppression of people who were offering contrary opinions, quite legitimately, is shocking.
FBI paid $3 million to Twitter to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Amazing thing. But they're not. But there are also people who were. You possibly remember the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yes, of course.
Really serious scientists saying this is a mistake, and these people were misrepresented as cranks and losers.
Anti-vaxxers.
It's absolutely outrageous, and there's been no proper expression of regret by those who did this, or rather more importantly, by those who joined in with it or didn't stand up against it. And you suffer as a society. That was half the point I was making. It's very hard for a society to recover from a self-inflicted wound of that size, when what you've basically done is refuse to think and condemn those who offered any kind of dissent. Dissent's important in society. You have to listen to it.
Indeed. Let's move on to another interesting item in your column. The King's speech.
The way these things get into language, and it's not the King's speech, is it? It's the Royal Christmas broadcast, or Christmas message, if you like. And that I blamed on that dreadful film called The King's Speech. It was so bad, and I said at the time, this film is going to infect public life because it's so full of rubbish, historically, factually wrong in almost every conceivable way. And it has, of course, and one of the most symbolic ways in which it's done this is everybody now calls the royal broadcast the King's Speech. But there are kinds of other. How does it happen? And we used to have things called railway stations, and often trains didn't turn up at them, but that's what they were called. Suddenly, about 15 years ago, everybody started calling them train stations. I think this came from some American soap opera. Now, the funny thing is, in America, they have hardly any trains. Not much in the way of railways, and yet an American expression for railway station took over. And then I was always, the English language had a thing called reflexive verbs. I commit myself to such and such a thing. Suddenly, the reflexive pronoun myself was removed, and so you now say I commit to.
Yeah.
Which actually sounds like some sort of religious weirdo saying he's about to plunge into a baptismal pool or something. It doesn't sound like somebody speaking politics. And again, and then there is this: you're speaking to somebody, they appear to be perfectly normal, and in the middle of the conversation, without any warning at all, they say, "Going forward."
Oh yeah.
And at that moment, you think, "Is this person okay? Where does it come from?
What are you going to do going forward?
Are they putting something in the water again?
Yeah, going forward.
Going forward, and of course, and verbing. Verbing, turning verbs into nouns into verbs.
Yes. I tell you one thing I hate is the when people say, "I've sent you an invite."
Yeah, that's just slang, though, isn't it? It's not. It's just because invitation is such a long word. But
it's not that tough to handle.
Well, it depends if you're in a hurry. I don't mind that so much. I can see the sense in it. But all these other things, they've just happened. And what really struck me about them was that they struck me. And I thought, this is odd, this is a change. And everybody else said, well, what are you worrying about? Why does it matter? I said, it matters because it's a change which I can't explain. And I'm disturbed by things which are inexplicable.
Indeed. What did you make of the King's royal Christmas message?
I have to confess something to you here. I have not, for many, many, many years, watched any of these things.
I'll tell you what, there's no point.
I don't. I know I can read about it.
It's just a load of platitudinous nonsense.
You can go. You can. There's this thing about looking at the furniture to see which pictures they put on the day. I just don't. On Christmas Day, it's not the thing that's on my mind. I don't know how many people there are who are like me. It's not that I'm, as you know, I'm a profoundly committed monarchist. Nothing to do with that. I just don't. Actually, it doesn't bother me in the slightest.
Yeah, well, he didn't really say anything. It's the usual.
Well, would he?
No, he's not really that type.
I mean, he will.
Do you think he will?
Oh, because she did. I mean, his mother was constantly guilty of little slips into political correctness and multiculturalism and stuff of that kind, which I would pick up on. And they were quite clearly there. And I remember I once rang up the palace and said, what is the Queen doing talking about this? Isn't it a breach of the Constitution? And they said, why don't you ask a constitutional expert? I said, do you have a list? Can you recommend anybody I can ask? Because if not, I am a constitutional expert and I say she shouldn't have said it. Okay, they said, but they are skilled in not reacting, like the really weird business of the Royal Standard, which I discovered a few weeks ago.
Well, they've, what the royal family has decided unilaterally and strangely, in my view, is that climate change, the promotion of the climate change ideology is not political. Well, it is. Can you hold that thought? Because we'll talk about this when we come back. But you mentioned that things have changed in terms of the royal standard. Where
I was pedaling my bicycle down the Mall the other day, and going past Clarence House, I looked up to see if the royal standard was flying from it, and it was. So I thought, oh, King's Inn. And I looked, because from that point in the road you can also see Buckingham Palace. I looked at Buckingham Palace and the Royal Standard was flying from there too. Now, as you know, the Royal Standard is supposed to fly from the place where the monarch is. Yeah. You can't be in both places at once. So I made what inquiries I could, and there was a certain amount of shuffling of feet. Yeah. Apparently they've now decided they fly them from both at once because they can't really be bothered to haul it down and haul it up again when he moves.
Oh, but that's all.
It's a bit sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
The oldest monarchy in the world, the last.
Can't be bothered anymore.
They can't be bothered to raise and lower a flag.
Yeah, I always like that when you have visitors from London. You say, "Oh, that means the Queen is in residence."
It's sort of mysterious and old, isn't it?
I like it. Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. But what about, on a more serious level, the fact that the royal family, William and Charles in particular, as you suggested, the Queen encroached on this territory as well. They seem to believe that whilst pledging political non-partiality, they seem to believe that preaching climate change emergency ideology is not political.
Exactly.
I've got news for them. It is.
Well, but by doing so, they basically closed the issue, because if the royal family say, if the monarch says this is a closed issue, then everybody else can say so. And we know that the BBC long ago decided it had a view on this and it wasn't listening to any other. And so here we are. No, it's a definite threat to free speech when the monarchy takes this view. When people say about the Queen, Charles, well, they've done a wonderful job. I said, well, okay, up to a point, but actually, on things like this, they've been extremely weak, and they've allowed themselves to be co-opted. I don't care what Charles thinks privately about this matter, but he certainly shouldn't allow himself to be used to declare that the case is closed, when, as you and I think believe, there is still an argument to be had about it, and quite a serious and complicated one. And it's wrong.
Absolutely. Let me ask you about slavery and historical racism reparations. Barbados is leading the charge. They're demanding millions of pounds in compensation from Richard Drax, a Tory MP whose family owns still plantations in Barbados, and many years ago, hundreds of years ago, kept slaves. They've now turned their sights on the actor Benedict Cumberbatch, which is quite funny because he's a left-wing lovey. Well, yeah. But he doesn't deserve this, in my view. My point would be, this is legal nonsense. You cannot punish people for crimes committed by other people.
No, and nor can you apologise for things you didn't yourself do. I think there is an argument, certainly, for those countries which were blighted by slavery, and blighted they were. And slavery was a terrible thing in so many ways. It destroyed, one of the things it destroyed was families. And therefore it made it very, very difficult for countries which had family life wrecks and people torn from their own closest kin. They've been undoubtedly hamstrung and held back by it ever since they began. And there's certainly a case for some sort of recompense being made. But to turn on individuals whose ancestors were involved in the slave trade it has to be wrong. It's not their fault. I think you have to separate the two, and also anybody who opposes this shouldn't be misrepresented as a defender of slavery, because I certainly, for one, am not. And the effect of slavery on the United States remains enormously powerful politically and in many, many other ways. It's just because the Civil War was won by the Union and slavery was abolished, it does not mean that country doesn't still have a very powerful and painful legacy, which will, I think, probably go on for centuries. So no, I'm all in favour of trying to do something about that, but it's quite different from going after individuals whose ancestors were involved in the slave trade.
But why do we now, I've never known this before, why do we agonise about events that happened 300, 400 years ago? And seem to feel that we're responsible?
No, I often find events of 300 or 400 years ago more interesting than events going on now.
They might be interesting, but we're not responsible.
No, because they do have a bearing on why is it that we are free, for instance? Why is it that we live in a law-governed country? Why is it that our landscape and our language are as they are? I'm not against looking at the past for lessons about how we should behave in the present. In fact, I wish more people did so and knew more about the past. At the moment, everybody seems to be taught about absolutely nothing except Hitler and Henry VIII. And so there's huge areas of the past they know nothing of, which would give them a great deal of insight into what was going on now. I'm not against that. Look at the past by all means, but don't draw silly lessons from it. Draw intelligent ones from it. Look at what really happened. Enter the past with as little prejudice as you can possibly manage, and see what you can find. But nothing wrong in that.
Shouldn't we just turn around to Barbados and say, you want millions of pounds from us, from various British citizens for slavery, for alleged crimes committed 300 years ago? Our answer to you is no.
You could say that, but I think it might be a bit thoughtless.
Why?
Well, I just think that we are. There's no doubt at all that this country and the people of this country lived in considerable prosperity compared with the rest of the world for a long time as a result of our engagement.
But that's not our fault now, is it?
It's not our fault now, but it is the foundation of our prosperity now. It's not unreasonable to say, well, maybe there is something we might do in recompense of that within reason. I'm not necessarily against it. But it doesn't mean that it should be done in an intelligent negotiation, not with demands and reparations and the searching out of individuals who are responsible, because nobody living is responsible for it. And I'm not against, in principle, the rich world helping the poor world. In fact, on the contrary, if the rich world doesn't help the poor world, then horrible consequences will undoubtedly follow. So again, if this is an argument for intelligent help by the rich world to the poor world, that's fine by me, provided it's intelligent help and not just some excuse. If the money that you send ends up in the pockets of despots and tyrants and corrupt officials, then there wouldn't have been any point in the first place, would there? It has to be spent in an intelligent fashion. Indeed.
Last question, really. We've only got a minute or so left. What worries you most about the year ahead?
War. Undoubtedly war. And war spreads, and it's very dangerous. in that way. The what is basically a Russo-American war being conducted in Ukraine could easily, by accident, spread if, for instance, the Ukrainians take more actions on Russian soil. Then the pressure among the Russian nationalist factions for some kind of military steps taken outside Ukraine in response might be quite strong. And once you get that, then it's very hard to see where it's limited. I do wish people would be more serious about pursuing a peace deal on this before it gets any worse.
I agree. I think we've got to do something about Ukraine this year, otherwise it could escalate.
Well, it could go on for a very long time, and the longer it goes on, the greater is the danger of some stupid outbreak of it into neighbouring countries.
And this is what to worry about. You're quite right. Peter, thank you so much for coming in. Peter Hitchens there, Mail on Sunday columnist. I'm wishing him a happy Christmas. He doesn't say Happy New Year. Right? But just quickly explain why that is.
Well, there's several reasons. New Year isn't English. When I was young, it didn't exist as a holiday in this country, so it has no resonance for me at all. It's hopelessly unfriendly to children because it happens in the middle of the night. And also, I associate it very strongly with the attempts. I lived in Soviet Moscow at the end of that era. They attempted to replace Christmas with the New Year. Mm-hmm. I think, why do you need two great festivals this time of year? Christmas seems quite enough to me, and it goes on, don't forget this, until Epiphany on January the 6th. And I'm going to carry on saying Happy Christmas till then, so Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas
to you and all your listeners.
Happy Christmas to you too,
and
Peter. Peter Hitchens, the brilliant Mail on Sunday columnist there.